Thank you, Amy. Coming up in 12 minutes after 8 o'clock, this is the early edition on CBC Radio 1, 88.1 FM, 690 AM in Vancouver. Well, a local Liberal MP is calling for a full review of the Port of Vancouver and the way it operates. Joe Peschisolido says Stephen Harper's Conservatives gutted the port's environmental review process. He says the federal Liberals were re-elected with a mandate to restore a meaningful review process, which includes more meaningful public consultation. Well, with more on this, we have reached Joe Peschisolido in Ottawa. He is the Liberal MP for Steveston, East Richmond. Good morning to you.
Stephen, how are you this morning?
I'm very well, thank you. So what are your main concerns about the way the Port of Vancouver operates today?
Well, two things. Just overall, in a global sense, I have concerns about the government's model of the port, its mandate, and the process that it goes when it deals with specific projects. And the specific projects that I, as a duly elected member of Parliament for Steveston, East Richmond, have is on the jet fuel project. Two things. I don't believe there was a proper assessment of the overall project. There were two open houses, and I don't think that's a proper way to go. The other thing is this, that there wasn't a proper assessment of alternatives to the particular project. The other issue that I have is more global. My view and the view of other members of Parliament in Metro Vancouver is that the port is a very important asset that we have. It's important not only for Metro Vancouver, but for the whole country. But we have to get things right. And the concern that we have is that under the Harper government, that the proper balance isn't there, where you have a port that should be landlords, you have the private sector that does the actual projects with terminals, and then you have other bodies. And under the Chrétien Martin government, you had environment and fisheries and oceans that looked at the environmental aspects and other things as well. So that overall is the concerns I have. And Stephen, if I may, to a broader point, my view and the view of other MPs is that the role of the port is to facilitate trade and to manage the port lands to do that. Its role is not to develop public policy as it relates to other things like farming and fisheries. The way I like to say it is that it should facilitate trade but not determine the terms of trade. And the terms of trade ought to be determined by the government and not an arm's length body.
We got a statement from the port this morning, just a few minutes ago, in fact, from the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. I just want to read it in part to you. It says, with due respect to the Member of Parliament, there appears to be a fundamental lack of understanding of the role of Canadian port authorities. As an agent of the federal government, we manage leases of federal land to tenants and ensure that the port operates safely and efficiently. We collect rents and fees from tenants and shippers, which are funneled into port operations and improvements. To suggest some inherent self-interest is influencing the authorities' permitting decisions, or that those decisions are not based on thorough environmental assessments, is failing to recognize the Port Authority's federal mandate and obligations. Are you failing to recognize the mandate and obligations of the Port Authority?
Well, Stephen, I don't think so. Under their letters patent, under the code of conduct that exists in the letters patent, the Board of Directors and the Port Authorities have an obligation, a positive obligation, to meaningfully engage with the community. And I don't believe that two open houses where proponents and the body that not only will review it, but the body that owns the land upon which the tank farm will be structured is meaningful community consultation. The second point is, in the letters patent and in their code of conduct, it clearly states that the port cannot be in a conflict of interest, nor in the appearance of a conflict of interest. Now, the staff and the board of directors are honorable men and women. My point is this, that just the overall structure, the way this is done, is at least an appearance of a conflict of interest, where you have proponents of a project having land that they purchased in 1997 beside land that is owned by the port. they don't look in a meaningful way to any alternatives. They just look at that project, and the entity that makes the determination on the permitting is the entity upon which the actual tank farm is being built. Now, I was doing a lot of young liberal politics when I was in law school, but I went to that class. And that's my point, that if you want to have, which we do, infrastructure, projects, economic growth, there has to be trust in that process by the people. That's the point I'm making.
But if you have specific concerns about the environmental review process, how does that lead to calling for a full review of the Port Authority and the way it operates, and that things are going to be done differently under the Liberals rather than Stephen Harper?
Because you have to do that, Stephen, because it's all interconnected. Because if you don't change the legislation, if you don't change the governance model, if you don't change the documents that regulate the bodies, well, then you're always going to have this problem. I mean, you have a situation right now with all of the legislation, whether it's a letters patent, which is the various acts, where you have a body that is the landlord, a body that also advocates for particular projects, and also a body that then gets to look at its own projects. That's a systemic problem, and you got to fix the system if you want to get things right.
How, though, is any organization supposed to be able to make plans for the long term if it's going to be subject to every whim of every change in government?
Exactly, and that's the point that I'm making. It can't. You need to have a process that is solid, a process that is reliable. And my argument, and a lot of the arguments of other members of parliament, is that the way the whole structure is leads to what you were just saying, Stephen, that when the Conservatives or the Harper government changed the legislation, it leads to this problem right now, that it leads to inherent conflicts. So only a proper review, and I have spoken to Minister Garneau. I will be speaking with the other ministers involved as well, Minister McKenna, Minister Tutu, to see what can be done. Because the port is such a phenomenal asset. We need trade, but we also have to balance it with the quality of life and also environmental concerns. And my view and other members of parliament believe that the only way to get that is we have to do a full review of what we've been talking about.
Joe Peschisolido, appreciate you taking our call this morning. Thank you very much.
Not at all. Thank you, Stephen.
You take care. Bye now.